going to need some more enthusiastic applause, guys, honestly. That, my man. It's one free firmware upload for you, my friend. All right, so I like to come up with like really short talk titles. So I thought this was a pretty good one. So what I'm going to talk about is basically the massive number of vulnerabilities, but not just vulnerabilities, also risks that exist in these devices that we really don't kind of think about, primarily because we don't have great visibility. So, come on. Please? Okay. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a startup called NetRise. I used to work at Cylance. Prior to that, I was at the Department of Energy, where I did ICS security at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the DOE lab that everyone knows is the most superior DOE lab. Prior to that, I was in the Marine Corps, where I went to Iraq and Afghanistan. I did not do cybersecurity things there. Luckily, my co-founder did do cybersecurity things when he was in the Marine Corps. Yeah, I've been on 60 Minutes and some other stuff, talked a lot. But the most important thing I really want to show you guys today is this picture of me and Chuck Norris. So a lot of people don't know, this is actually the day we won the global war on terrorism. Me, Chuck, his beard, and a positive attitude is all it took. So yeah, that's from 2007. I was slightly younger. All right. So we'll talk about the vulnerability disparity problem, identification methods, the power of the SBOM, comparing different vulnerability data sources, non-CVE risk identification, prioritizing remediation, then a handful of case studies to kind of highlight some of the madness that exists. Man, you got to be like right on this thing. All right, a few things to ponder. So these are just some questions to think about as we kind of go through things. Do all of your ICS devices have CPEs? The answer is no. Do all of the manufacturers have product security teams that can be contacted? I'll give you guys a hint. It's no. Is all risk determined by CVEs? Does the National Vulnerability Database provide a comprehensive list of CVEs for these things? Who is responsible for submitting CPEs? And what are end-day vulnerabilities? So these are some things to kind of just chew on and think about. So first thing I'll talk about is sources of vulnerability information. So if you are a person buying a device or using a device, whatever it is, you essentially have like 3 ways to get vulnerability information that don't cost you any money, basically, right? So you have the National Vulnerability Database. So who here knew that there's like 30 national vulnerability databases? Yeah. Well, you guys don't count. But I mean, we have 2 in the United States, right? Now the good news is they're fairly trued up. That's usually just because there's like a delay when things get pushed between one of them. They're usually pretty good. But you look at like the Chinese National Vulnerability Database, there's all kinds of shenanigans that happen in those national vulnerability databases. This is actually a slide from a friend of mine named Kristen Del Rosso, who works at Sophos. She gave this talk at HOU.SEC.CON about the differences between the different national vulnerability databases, and it's such a good talk. I mean, like the Chinese government's like removing vulnerabilities from things because they don't. It's really good. The other location is the vendor product security page, right? That's assuming there is one. And then lastly, you have researchers. So the Clarities of the world, whoever it is, that go out and find vulnerabilities and publish them. Of course, they do find their way into the NVDs, but just as like a basic kind of like overview here. Now, of course, there are companies that can do this for you as well. You can pay for consulting engagements. You can pay vendors to find things for you. But in terms of like just going out and looking on your own, that doesn't cost really any money. These are really your routes. So acronyms, who doesn't love them? The reason I want to bring this up is because, number one, like as an example, the National Vulnerability Database does not submit pearls, which is like insane. Supposedly, they're talking about submitting it in version 5.1. Someone opened up an issue on their on their GitHub to do that, so that would be great. But basically, Perls are for, software packages, so NPM packages, RPM packages, like all those kind of things that have vulnerabilities and risk that people are not aware of since they're not in the National Vulnerability Database. Then you have CPEs, which, there's overlap here, of course, but CPEs are kind of, sort of, like reserved for things like devices, operating systems, applications, things like that. Like I said, there is overlap, though. Then obviously CVEs are just vulnerabilities. And who does this is kind of buried, right? It's MITRE, that's part of NIST, kind of, that feeds up to CISA, that feeds up to DHS. So we actually just got our CNA this week on Tuesday, which is pretty cool. So we had to go through that process and navigate working with all those folks. So it was actually pretty smooth, but interesting nonetheless. So components that have a CPE, there's also one known as SWID tags. It's not really used as much as everyone would kind of like it to be. But the point is, if they have something like this, we can then analyze this for known vulnerabilities. So why is this so much harder for ICS and OT? We'll talk about why. So this is the way we kind of think about component identification, like evolution. And when I say a component can be a library, a dependency, an application, a binary. A component is like a broad number of things. So step one, and by the way, all of these things aren't, they can't be 100% accurate for a million different reasons. So identifying a component, but this is based on compiled code, by the way. So having a perfect SBOM from this kind of approach, I think is impossible, actually. And the reason is you have so many proprietary components that are in these things as well that you can't possibly know what the versions are. So unless you're working directly with the device manufacturer, things like that, then you have backports. There's just so many issues that can come up. So that's probabilistic. Then you have vulnerability correlation. This can typically be 100% right. If you know the version of something, you take that, you look it up to the NVD, and you get the vulnerabilities for it. That's all there is to do. Vulnerability validation is a pretty big nightmare, especially in ICS and OT devices. And the reason why is because we're talking about things that are in firmware, right? Well, who here can tell me if a hash value is meaningful in firmware? It is not. It is not. Because everybody recompiles everything. So if you're like, oh, okay, this is OpenSSL 1.1.1, I'll just take a hash of it and then look it up and see if they match. They won't, ever. So things that work in the software space do not work in the firmware space for all kinds of reasons. So that's vulnerability validation. You can do things like function hashing and a bunch of other stuff that can get you closer. Available exploits, this is typically pretty close to 100%. Now, does that mean everybody knows about every exploit the NSA has? No. But you can aggregate 40 or 50 data sources or whatever it is and get a pretty good coverage of the available exploits for a particular vulnerability. Great. And then exploitability in context of the device. This is the holy grail. I don't know that this is, if someone figures this out, they've basically solved cybersecurity. Because the ability to basically take a component, validate the vulnerabilities in there from compiled code, and then determine if it is exploitable within the context of the device while only having a static firmware image is how is that even possible, right? You have to emulate things, all the different hardware. It's just, I don't think it's feasible. You can provide a lot of value though. All right. So first case study is around OpenSSL to show you guys how awesome the NVD is. So two CPEs here. They're both for OpenSSL. Okay? This is OpenSSL. It's called OpenSSL. Awesome. Here's another one called OpenSSL_project. Why? No one knows. It's one of history's mysteries. So if you are a vendor or an end user or whoever, and you look up this version of OpenSSL, and you pick the wrong one of them has 90 vulnerabilities, and one of them has 1. And of course, there's no overlap between the two, because that makes sense. So what we did to validate this is we took, you see the purple dots are the different OpenSSL components, and we took function hashes of every single function in that component, and it had a perfect 100% match. So we knew that both of these things were identical, And so that's just one of the ways that you can kind of do that. But this just kind of shows the madness that exists here. And so to really do this, you basically have to like rebuild the National Vulnerability Database on your own, like eliminate duplicates, do all this other stuff that you would hope you wouldn't have to do. But that's just, not the way it works. All right, another case study here is around CPE submissions. So does anybody here know who can submit a CPE? MITRE people, okay. Any other guesses? Anyone in the world can submit a CPE. Anyone. Henceforth, this problem, right? So, this clicker is going to make me kill somebody. So when we look at firmware, one of the things we do is we determine a version, and then after that, the last step is, can we validate that this CPE exists in the NVD, right? And if it does, great. That's like a last step of validation. That's awesome. However, what happens more times than we care to admit is we'll go through our component identification process, and we will be like 99% sure that this component is this version. But then we will look up and see, does this thing exist in the NVD as a CPE? And the answer is no. So we got to thinking, how is that? Like, how can this component with really good version information not be like somewhere? Especially since we found this one in particular like all over the place. And we were like, okay, it must be like a piece of proprietary code that is just fairly like, well utilized. It is not. So this is an open source component actually. We just looked it up in GitHub. We found it. And so now think about how kind of insane this is. There's an open source component that obviously you have source available to you. You found in all these firmware images. How hard would it be? So if there's no CPE, there is no what? There is no CVEs. And so, but now we have access to this open source component, and we have access to the source code, and we know what devices it's on. How hard is it going to be for us to write an exploit for that code? Not very. That's why we wanted to go get our CNA so we could start dropping CVEs on fulls. So this is, there's I don't even know the number, tens of thousands of situations like this. So, and that's not even counting the proprietary binaries. This is just like open source stuff that's out there. Yeah, this just shows how you can submit it. Unbelievably, it takes like 24 hours. That's it. It's like the fastest thing the government does. It's really crazy. Derek, who just walked in, who works for us, is actually the guy who handles a lot of our CPE submissions. So yeah, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was going to take like 6 months or something. And this was just like, oh yeah, we got it in there, looks good. And I was like, okay. So let's talk about other ways in which we can identify vulnerabilities that people are accustomed to, especially in this room. Outside in versus inside out vulnerability identification. So, is network-based vulnerability identification sufficient? Does anyone have a thought on that? Yes. Like a Clarity, a Dragos, a SynSaber, those kind of folks. Right, okay. Now, I'm always, like, these technologies and solutions are 1,000,000% required. So it's not to say, like, don't use them. Number one, I want to get out of here with my life, because I see Joria sharpening a knife under the table. But here's how it typically works, right? So the network sensor identifies a device exists. Great. Either via active or passive means. Based on this data, it identifies the make, model, firmware version. It takes that data and turns it into a CPE, and then it checks that CPE against the vulnerability databases to return vulnerabilities. So based on what I've told you already, does anybody see a problem with that? Right? Like, we're operating under the assumption that there is a CPE, and that if there is a CPE, that someone has put out CVEs for that, which is less than likely. And it was created accurately, right? So is this better or worse or just different? The answer is different. It's not better or worse necessarily. But it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to like build an asset inventory, then yeah, outside in is like the way to go. Like if you're trying to build an asset inventory, don't like have someone come and look at all your firmware, right? That's a real slow way to do it. But if you want to build an asset inventory in a fast way, network-based is the right way to do it. But if vulnerability identification is the angle, then you probably want to take a deeper look at things. All right, so data sources for better identification. So if we are operating under the assumption that outside in gives you a piece of the puzzle, and by the way, the outside in solutions, what they can find, we can't, right? Because they might be finding vulnerabilities associated with open ports and services that are available and things like that we just don't have visibility to. So how do we do this? So the way in which you do this is by analyzing the operating system of these devices, which is obviously the firmware of the device. And so we have to identify these components and other relevant artifacts to indicate risk, which I already walked through that kind of component identification evolution. So SBOMs, I think everybody here knows what an SBOM is probably, right? It's basically an ingredients list of a particular thing. People talk about, I'll talk about some SBOM misconceptions in a bit, but we're not talking about giving anybody the recipe here. We're just talking about a list of ingredients. It's a big difference. So for all the folks who are like, oh, you're going to steal our intellectual property. But no one cares about your intellectual property. So things we have a bill of materials for. Food, hardware, chemicals. Makes sense, right? Makes sense to have a bill of materials for that. Other things we have a bill of materials for. Which one is more important? Okay? Pretty important. Pretty important. Okay? Which one do you think we should have a bill of materials for? This red wagon. Jesus. Or this programmable logic controller? Which one do you guys think? Who says the red wagon? 100% right. So this is the craziness, right? Like this thing can be doing wildly critical things, like whatever. Responsible for doing something, building nuclear weapons, pumping oil, like whatever. And this thing, a 2-year-old goes in. And yet, we can tell you exactly what comprises that red wagon. And even the people who build that thing can't tell you what it's made of. Does that make sense? Probably not. This is why we have the vulnerability disparity, right? So SBOM types, three: generating SBOMs, consuming SBOMs, and then disseminating them. So sharing them out. The state of SBOM, so the big executive order came out last May. Lots of pretty hilarious language in the National Defense Authorization Act, if any of you guys remember that, where they basically said like the federal government shall not procure any software or hardware that has any known vulnerabilities. I was like, the federal government's going to save a shitload of money. Like, man, they're just... And if someone was just like, this is going to be good. This is going to work out really well. Huge. I mean, there's an article every week about like the 320 software supply chain startups that are coming. I mean, I like to think we started the revolution. We definitely did not, but so software versus firmware. And then the two big formats are Cyclone DX and SPDX. SPDX is being adopted by Microsoft and has an ISO certification, so it's probably going to end up winning. It's the VHS of like the Betamax kind of thing, Cyclone DX is awesome. Most people actually prefer Cyclone DX. It's like way easy. It's just better. And it's maintained by OWASP and a guy named Steve Springett, who is an awesome guy. You should check out his stuff. So we have a blog coming out that we're actually going to. Who here is familiar with like the pyramid of pain for like incident response, right? So we're about to drop a knowledge bomb on people for the SBOM pyramid of pain, which we have not done yet. So if any of you steal it, I will find you. So source code versus compiled code. Getting source can be hard, especially when you're acting as a third party, which is what we are doing most of the time. If we're working with device manufacturers, then great, we'll take it, it can help. We've built everything we've done on zero knowledge analysis, like evidence-based zero knowledge analysis, so a total black box approach, which is, by the way, the hardest way possible to do it. So if you look at the top, you have like binaries and libraries, scripts, blah, blah, blah. A lot of companies will work, like they'll start at containers and things like that. These things are really, really easy to get components for, and they have they'll even have like a file in there that just tells you, here's everything that's in it, right? So we started the opposite way because we're masochists, and both me and my co-founder are former Marines, so we like to just do things the hard way. So software versus firmware component identification. For software, much better documentation, very well documented whitelists, right? Like Windows has like an NSRL, like what software comes on Windows, like everybody knows. Hashes work most of the time. Tools have been around for decades to go through all the software. Firmware, generally operating under the assumption of zero knowledge or black box. Even if you're working with the manufacturer, you have this problem. So imagine you're working with like Rockwell on one of their PLCs. Does Rockwell build all of the firmware on that PLC? No. They're using VxWorks, they're using a bunch of other shit that they don't even have control over. So you still have the same problem. Hashes don't work. Versions are an absolute nightmare. I mean, I think I saw an emoji in a version number one time. I mean, it's just like, there's like hieroglyphs. It's crazy. Multiple CPEs for the same component, which I already showed you an example of that. And then proprietary software has no CPEs. Like Cisco firmware as an example, the overwhelming majority of binaries they have are proprietary. Even like their version of OpenSSL, they've totally rewritten for their own use cases. So you can't even like look it up. And I've talked to a lot of these people at these bigger companies and basically said like, why don't you guys submit CPEs for these things so people can like compare them? And they're like, oh, Tom, we do. And I was like, okay. Would you like 10,000 or 100,000 examples of where you do not? And like these people a lot of times don't even understand like the nature of this challenge, which is kind of crazy. But if we don't have anything to look it up against, we have no way to validate anything. So like you can still do analysis, like you can still do like reverse engineering, but if you have a firmware image with 1,000 binaries on it, and you can only conclusively identify 100 of them, which is actually not bad, you have to somehow reverse engineer the other 900, and then what, just like make up a version for it? Because you don't have a version for it. And that's not even counting the problem of backports, which no one has ever been able to explain to me, ever. No one has ever given me a good reason that we update code and leave the version the same. Does anyone have a good answer? It's baffling to me. They're just like, yeah, well, we only patched like these 4 vulnerabilities and replaced 400 lines of code. That's it. And you're like, okay. Because we'll do things for folks, and we're like, yeah, this is the version of this thing, it has these vulnerabilities, and they're just like, yeah, we backported that. That's actually not right. And we're just like, okay, awesome. So, how do SBOMs help? We have a lack of visibility problem, which causes the vulnerability disparity problem. If you can't see in things, you can't understand what the risk is, obviously. Even fully updated firmware does not mean it's without risk. We've seen in so many scenarios where someone will update a firmware image and it will actually have more vulnerabilities than the one that was there previously. Whoops. So when I was at DOE, like one of the first things I had to deal with was heartbleed and shell shock. And they were like, all right, Tom, go figure out where these software components are that have these vulnerabilities. And I'm thinking to myself, like, no problem, got it. And I started, talking to the ICS folks and all that, and I realized we had zero technical capabilities to do this at scale, and basically zero capabilities to do it even not at scale. So that basically left me up with reaching out to the device manufacturers. And I don't know how many people have done that in here, but let's just say that that's less than effective most of the time. One such manufacturer, who I'm actually really good friends with this guy now, because we're in the trenches for a while together. This is an enormous, factory automation vendor. He had to email 635 people internally. I don't know if I've emailed 635 people in the last year. I mean, it's pretty wild, right? And we didn't even get great answers. Like, we didn't even get perfect answers. Like, yep, this is affected, this isn't, blah, 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 blah. Okay, no continuous monitoring. Everyone knows continuous monitoring is an important thing, but for some reason it's not important for important things. Makes sense? This is a vulnerability that got announced in April of 2020 from Siemens. The vulnerability release date was August of 2018. So this was not a new vulnerability. It was just found in Siemens, in the kernel. How hard is it to identify a Linux kernel? Not very. And then look up that Linux kernel, which does have a CPE and is in the National Vulnerability Database. But if no one's looking, then it's pretty hard to see. So what this means is, effectively, 609 days, all of these devices that are doing important stuff had this vulnerability that could have taken down these things very easily. So a lot of this work is happening from consulting engagements. It's not comprehensive, it's not continuous, all those kind of things. So, SBOM misconceptions real quick before I get into like some 2 more case studies. Am I providing a roadmap to the attacker? The only people who aren't benefiting from the visibility is us. That's it. If I can open up a firmware image and find vulnerabilities, the fact that like someone else can't is just like hilarious. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. So that's one thing. Is it intellectual property disclosure? I already talked about that. The answer is no, right? And they do give you, there are like cases where you can like leave things out or whatever. And then will this increase my licensing costs is something else people get concerned about, which I think is also a red herring. And people do push back sometimes about like reverse engineering these things. They're like all of our EULAs say you can't do that. And I was like, that might be the case. Those EULAs are not even worth the paper they're written on. There's so much case precedent from like the Supreme Court and other places saying that if you are doing, and this isn't even really reverse engineering, it's like opening a Linux file system and enumerating through it to identify software components. Like if that's reverse engineering. So now there might be like a proprietary compression algorithm that you have to reverse engineer to get to the file system, things like that. But what the Supreme Court basically came out and said was, listen, what's the intent here? The intent is to identify risk associated with these devices to prevent bad things from happening, right? Like, we're not trying to reverse engineer something to be like, all right, we're going to go make our own PLCs. Like, it's not what we're interested in doing. So if you have an SBOM, now what? You can enrich it, operationalize it, send it to a SIM, integrate it with CI/CD pipelines, blah, blah, blah. You can now make better informed decisions. In Ronnie's talk yesterday, which was excellent, he talked about, like why are we caring so much about like these PLCs that are, if you have access, if you can exploit a vulnerability, that's not even the thing you need to do. You probably have physical access, right? You can do other things. Having this level of visibility can help you understand like, okay, everything after this is just like a lost cause, right? So let's really shore up like maybe this telecommunication infrastructure, like the routers, the switches, all that kind of stuff, so that people can't get from here into here. And you'll see based on one of the case studies I walk through why that is maybe not as easy as we would like it to be. Okay, I think this is one of the most important parts. So figuring out how and why something happens is pretty easy and straightforward, right? We all know how to do incident response. Like we can do root cause analysis. We can do patient zero identification. We can do all those things. Like, okay, someone hacked this thing, it blew up, like whatever. We can figure out how and why that happened, right? The question that no one can answer is this. Where else can this happen? It cannot be answered. So, and I'll walk through the pipe dream case study highlights this really well, as does the other one I'll walk through. But this is something to kind of think about here. This problem does not exist for like Windows, Like we know, okay, it happened here, so it also can happen in all these other places where Windows is, right? But that same logic does not apply here. So, first case study is, and I'm happy to hear some thoughts on this actually. I don't call out who the vendor is because we found so much shit. It probably just isn't fair. They don't even have a product security team to really reach out to. But what I wanted to highlight here is I didn't want to use something like a PLC that's just inherently insecure. I wanted to pick a network switch that should be, fairly secure, fairly. Having direct access to this switch would not necessarily be like a super obvious target for like most folks. But after I walk you through some things, you might change your mind. So, if you look up this vendor for this particular switch, you will find a grand total of 0 entries in any of the NVDs, right? What does this mean? There's no CPE for it. They've never submitted a CPE for anything they've ever built, ever. So if you are an end user and you would like to understand the risk associated with this device, those methods I showed you at the beginning, right? Like looking at the end, like all those approaches would all yield 0. They'd all yield 0. And this actually creates a really interesting, what's the word? Like contrarian, here it is, counterintuitive thought process. So if I'm looking up a switch, or looking up anything, and I don't find any vulnerabilities or a CPE for it, and then I look up like a Cisco thing, and it does have a CPE in all these vulnerabilities, which one is likely more secure? Not the one with no vulnerabilities. Because what that indicates is there's not even anybody looking. There's not even anybody going through like a reasonable product security process, which is kind of like a counterintuitive thing, but it proves to be incredibly accurate. So something to keep in mind. Yeah, so clearly this means, right, that no vulnerabilities means that this company has just written perfectly secure software, right? Probably not. So, since there's no CPE, there's no vulnerabilities, right? This is a screenshot of a few of the vulnerabilities. These are some of the critical ones. So there's 1,414 unique vulnerabilities for this network switch. And by the way, we're not even identifying, I forget the total number of components we identify in this thing. It's like maybe like 150. That's 1,400 vulnerabilities just for that many components. There's at least double that many components, probably conservatively. So not only that, what's really important in this space is giving a way to prioritize data. So one of the ways that makes sense here is using exploit information. So 34 of these vulnerabilities have weaponized exploits. What that means from these definitions is weaponized here means either it has been seen in the wild or it is part of like a automated exploit framework, like Metasploit or something like that. POC means it's a proof of concept, like an exploit exists, but it's not part of anything. It hasn't been seen in the wild, just like an exploit has been written. And then the last one is unproven, which means there is no exploit. So the point here is that a lot of vulnerabilities? Yes. Do we need to solve them all? No. And you could even if you wanted to, which I'll talk about more later. But the other interesting thing is of those 34 weaponized exploits for those vulnerabilities, that only affects 3 software components, OpenSSH, glibc, and the kernel. So if you update those 3 components, I know I'm simplifying updating a Linux kernel, but just bear with me for the sake of argument, that drastically reduces the risk that you have associated with this device. Sir?
What about the dependency mapping of those and what's also needed in order for that exploit to be successful?
Yep.
Also a different problem?
It is a different problem. Yep. And I'm literally building like a whole separate talk on just that problem. So, those are just vulnerabilities. Oh, this doesn't look great, but that's okay. So this is non-CVE risk, non-vulnerability risk. So what you have here is all these like misconfiguration checks that you can do. So as an example, we have here multiple users with UID 0, which is like root, not having SC Linux turned on, et cetera, et cetera. So think about this as like dis-a-stig checks, something like that. And then over here on the right-hand side is a list of all of the credentials that exist in that switch. Now in this case, there were no default credentials that we could find, and there were no like hashes that we were able to crack. So if we do find hashes, we send them off to a password cracking rig and usually are fairly successful. Additional non-CVE risk here is this is every binary that is in that firmware image. I think there's 538 of them. And what we do here is we check for exploit protections. If there's vulnerabilities that have like memory corruption, vulns, or whatever, we leverage these kind of different ways to determine if they are more or less susceptible to being exploited. And then another thing we highlight is basically here you find, by the way, this is the rule, not the exception, where we find both the public and private keys of the same key pair in the firmware. This is, when I say this is the rule, like when we find an image that doesn't have this, it's like a miracle. And I'm talking about enormous companies, like Fortune 10 companies, automotive manufacturers, like crazy. And it's wild, you know? And you would think like maybe there's a, like, oh, this must have been really hard to extract this firmware and get to a file system. Nope, really easy. And if you look closely, 2 of these are actually tied to OpenVPN. So if it's connecting over that, you can just decrypt the traffic if you have the keys, which are not hard to come by. So as I mentioned, another case study here, Pipe Dream. So uncovered by Jogos, Mandiant, CISA. I mentioned this already. Understanding how and why something happens, pretty straightforward. Open source components and even some proprietary components are common across multiple devices and manufacturers, like in this scenario, right? The HOU.SEC.CON and OPC UA are like the 2 things that I really want to harp on. And by the way, that's a screenshot from Jogos. This is a screenshot from their research as well. But here's the important thing. If we just like ignore the bottom half for a second, and we only call out like Omron and Schneider Electric and those protocols, like everyone agrees that that's probably a problem, right? But when you get to the bottom, that's the bigger problem. These are just the things we know about. If we come down here, due to HOU.SEC.CON and OPC UA, potentially hundreds of other, these are unique devices, not just, product models, not unique devices, of other devices are affected across industry verticals. Like, most people can't even tell you what PLC they have in their environment, let alone if it's running the HOU.SEC.CON SDK. So this is what is missing and like is just kind of crazy that we don't have this kind of visibility. So how do I reduce risk, you know, that we can find here, and how do we try to help manage it? Combining outside in and inside out vulnerability identification, I think is the way to go for sure. If you approach vulnerability management for these kinds of devices the same way you want to approach your enterprise vulnerability management program, I can only guarantee you one thing: you are going to fail miserably. Especially if you're an end user of the device, because you do not have control over the code, right? You can update the firmware, you can like do some things, you can yell at your manufacturer, you can do all that stuff. And some things don't even need to be updated. Maybe they're not used, or maybe they're not exploitable in how the device is running, and like all those other things. But whenever people say that to me, you know, and they go, yeah, Tom, well, you know, 90% of the vulnerabilities aren't even exploitable. And I'm like, okay, so if I found 1,400 vulnerabilities and 90% of them are not exploitable, you know what, you guys are right. 120 exploitable vulnerabilities is totally fine. That's totally fine. But that's like, those are the arguments I get. And I'm just like, okay. So prioritizing the risk here by enriching the data is super important. Like patching a vulnerability with no exploit that is critical, or a low vulnerability with a weaponized exploit, right? You can only do that after you've enriched the data in some way. Make all the credentials and configurations as secure as you can. That can like drastically reduce attack surface and risk. And then communicate with your vendors. Leverage this risk data for procurement and as part of your third-party risk program. We've done so much work for people, like acting as like a gating mechanism, basically, where, hey, we want to buy this thing, and we say, okay, we take a look at it, and we go like, all right, here's like 4 things we think they should fix. And obviously this doesn't work if you're like Steve's Auto Body, right? But if you're, you know, Idaho National Labs or you're Next Air Energy or something like that, like you have a pretty big stick, you know? So, and these manufacturers are willing to work. And if you do this on the front end, and this is where everyone talks about, yeah, but legacy, Tom. And I'm like, okay, I get it. It's a different problem. But if you use something like this on the front end, and you basically say, like, we want to buy this thing, but we're not buying it until like these things get fixed. I know I'm like oversimplifying a lot of like the practical parts of that. Like, it's not like it's not the same thing as just like changing the code overnight. They have to do all this like regression testing and safety testing. I get it. But it doesn't mean you can still buy it. You could leverage this to say something like, hey, we're happy to buy this as it is now, but we expect these things to be fixed in the next 6, 12, whatever's reasonable. But this just gives you another way to have intelligent conversations with your manufacturers and vendors and actually have data to support the things that you want fixed. That is all I got. Happy to take any questions.